Welcome to the Recover You podcast. I'm Kylene.
And I'm Patrick.
We are a couple in recovery
from sex addiction
and betrayal trauma. Together, we share our story to encourage you on your journey. It's here that we talk about sex addiction, betrayal trauma, mental, emotional, and physical health, faith, and anything and everything needed to recover you to your most authentic self that God created you to be. Okay, welcome everyone to another episode of Recover You. Hi, Patrick.
Hello, Kylene. We're here to talk about betrayal trauma and sex addiction.
Okay, and supposedly Patrick is the one that's tired today, but he's a little slap happy, I think. So we'll see what we get here.
If you hear snoring, it's not really my fault.
Okay, today's episode, we're going to talk about sharing your story and why we think that finding a safe way to do that is very, very important and actually beneficial to your healing. So just to begin this episode, I'm going to make the statement that there is a difference between putting someone on Facebook blast before you have, information and understanding and stuff like that, and versus, the idea that we're going to be talking about, which is letting people you trust in on the reality of what's happening in your life. Okay. So the reason we thought that this would be a really great topic to discuss this week is because we see a lot of resistance, but obviously for me, a ton in the betrayal community. I don't know about as much. Well, yeah.
You hear guys say, I could never do that.
Yeah. So, I'll just kind of summarize it for the betrayal community really quickly. There's a lot of shame. There's a lot of embarrassment. And especially in the beginning phases, like the first couple months, there's a real fear of telling anybody anything that's going on in your life. And so we're going to talk about reasons people don't want to share their story, what this can do when you hold it all inside and how that can actually be detrimental, reasons you should consider sharing your story, and then what to consider. Like, what do you take into consideration when you're thinking about, like, I want to do this in a safe way? And so that's one thing I just want to start this whole topic by saying is that we're not telling you to do, like, oh my gosh, like a Facebook blast of like, my husband cheated on me, right? Like, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how do you live an authentic life with this really, really hard thing without having to do it alone. Mm-hmm. Like, you're going through something incredibly difficult. So how can we navigate this with support? And that's what I want for you, because community, we talk about this all the time. Community is how we are supposed to heal, is by connection with other people. And that's how we're designed. We're beings of connection and community. And so I want to make sure that no one is from a place of fear or scarcity or embarrassment or shame hindering a huge aspect of something that can really help you heal.
Yeah, I think when sharing has a multitude of definitions. There's certainly what we've done. There's certainly what the actor Terry Crews has done. There's certainly all of those things where you get really, really, big, broad audiences. But sometimes sharing is just in a group with 3 other people.
We're going to talk about that in a little bit too, like kind of what the context, how to decide what the context is. We'll talk about that too. But yeah, so what do you think are some of the reasons that people don't share? I have a list for betrayal. So for you had just mentioned that the addict really sometimes is really nervous about sharing as well, or has this idea of like, I just won't tell anybody. So let's maybe even put this under the umbrella of, we're going to couch this topic under the umbrella of, it's already been outed within the relationship. Okay, so like the 2 of you are already on the same page. So we're talking about getting support and sharing your story after that has happened. So discovery, disclosure, whatever that looks like. But this is something that has come to the surface in your relationship. And so what are some of the reasons that you think that addicts might have to say, like, I'm not going to tell anybody, I'm not going to share my story?
It really is that one thing in your life that you want to go to your grave with, right? That you really just don't want to tell anybody. It's embarrassing. It's deeply, deeply personal. Mm-hmm. I mean, deeply personal. It is, it's hurtful. It's all of the things that are wrapped up in the shame that has kept you there. It really plays on, talking about it publicly is back into shame. Shame feeds the addiction. Addiction feeds shame. All of these different things. So I think that's why the addict would be like, I'm not telling anybody.
And it can do that, right? But it doesn't have to do that. So we'll kind of talk about that as well, is a lot of these stories that we're creating around the fear of this don't actually have to be reality when it happens. So a lot of things that we choose not to do in life, we've created really scary stories around. I mean, even the idea of being found out or getting help for the addiction itself is like this ultimate scary thing. And then when you finally do it, you're like, why didn't I do that 10 years ago? So sharing your story can be the same way. We can create a lot of interpretations and a lot of stories and a lot of scenarios around this in our mind. And what our brain does to protect us is goes worst case, always worst case, right? And a lot of times those are, nobody's going to love me. Everybody, it's going to dramatically change my life and that sort of thing. The other thing I'm going to say just here is we also realize there's a huge spectrum of different behaviors. And so there may be some things that we don't talk about in the context of this that are more specific to you. So for example, like we're talking about like general porn and sex addicts. So we're not necessarily going to be touching on the topic of people that have engaged in illegal behavior within this. Okay. So that is a different topic that may have different considerations around what we're talking about today that we're not really going to touch on. So I just want to make that part really clear. We're talking about general, like I've had an affair, or I had a pornography addiction, but nothing illegal has occurred. And now we're trying to sort of like work through this. Okay. So just to make that clear too, because I do think there are different, some specific scenarios that are, some unusual considerations that people may have to take into account that is maybe not the as much the norm, I guess I would say, but there's so many people just dealing with, more commonly just affairs and porn addiction, stuff like that. So some things that I thought through when I was thinking about like common reasons that people don't want to tell people. They don't want to ask for support. They don't want to share what's happening. They don't want to tell anybody what's happening. One reason is church pressure not to. So people have literally been told, like one of the first things that people from a faith background are going to do is go to their pastor when this happens. And we've mentioned that a lot. It's a really common thing, and it should be a very safe thing to do that. If everything worked the way it should and everyone was trauma informed and pastors lived out the gospel, then that would be a very safe thing to do. Unfortunately, it's often very not, and it causes a lot of harm. And one of the ways that they end up perpetuating the abuse cycle and hindering women from actually getting the help that they need is by perpetuating a message that says, like, you actually should not tell anybody that this is happening in your home. And this is going to sound super, I don't want it to, but I think it's the reality. I don't want it to sound bitter or, anger, anything like that. It's just the reality of what happens sometimes. The underlying motivation sometimes behind this is to keep the cycle going of the historical, for millennia now, men in charge holding a specific position. We can't do anything that upsets that system. And I know that sounds like a very broad statement, and it is, and it's not for every situation. And there are good people out there that just want to do the right thing and want to protect the victim. But a lot of times what you end up seeing is this super deeply, deeply, deeply cult-like ingrained belief system that's not biblical. That is really, and the women absorb it as well very deeply. And it is this idea of protect the men at all costs. And the problem with that is that then it literally sets up a system that allows abuse. It allows people to get away with really horrific things without really facing any sort of consequence, because over and over and over and over, what you see is women going into these church scenarios getting told it's not a big deal. Everybody does it. It's every man's battle. Don't tell anyone what you're going through, or you just need to have more sex, or you need to work harder on forgiveness, or this is actually your fault, or you need to be a better wife, or, whatever it is. And so it's just a really terrible situation. So one of the reasons women don't tell other women or get help or go to therapy or do any of the things that will actually help them heal is because the church tells them not to in a lot of situations.
And I think by extension, some of that advice that's coming from the pastoral team, could be born out of the fact that they know that if they have this issue and they come clean about it, they're going to lose their jobs. That there is no sense of safety in that whole environment. And you've seen that. You've seen pastors come out and say, hey, I've fallen. And what happens? They get kicked out. Mm-hmm. There is no sense of, hey, we're going to help. We're going to have you step away for a while. We're going to actually have you enter a therapeutic program. You're not going to be able to preach. You're not going to be able to do. But, while you're getting safe again, and we're going to come alongside and support your wife and your family through this. And so like imagine if the pastoral staff had the positive side of that, they'd be able to approach couples as they came in a much more positive way. But I think it's like you were talking about, like the patriarchy, but I think it's even,
I hate it.
Yeah, but I think it's even more ingrained because a pastor, and I saw it growing up, is they get thrown off the bus and they're gone.
Every system that exists is going to have a natural tendency to protect the system that exists. Mm-hmm. And so that's going to be the natural tendency, the natural desire. And so and you see this everywhere, right? You see it in any relational system, you see it in any vocational system, in any business system. I mean, it's always going to be protect the system that exists, that's working, right? And what you see less frequently, but is really admirable, is when the leaders in those systems go, what we're really seeking is truth. What we're really seeking is justice. What we're really seeking is empathy and kindness, no matter what the fallout of that is. And so that's less common, and it is unfortunate, but that's really what, the church should be. And we do have cases of that. And I've talked openly about how the current church that we go to was very safe for me. And I knew that. And so I went to my pastor and I talked, and he had a wonderful response, but that was not my experience in previous churches, And so one of the first things that he asked that I was so proud of him for asking was, do I need to know anything in terms of protecting the people in my church? And he wanted to know, is there any illegal activity, anything like that? And so, and he wasn't saying that, he was saying it from a place of love and compassion, but also like, this is my job as a leader. What do I need to know? And so anyway, don't want to get too off topic but reasons people don't, we cannot skip over the fact that there is a deep faith base here. There are a lot of faith-based reasons and a lot of cycles that have been perpetuated for a really, really, really long time that are not biblical, that are not true, that are not just, that do really keep people from communicating what's happening in their lives. And ultimately, what the church should be is a hospital. I was just reading this passage the other day where, Jesus was saying to the Pharisees when they were questioning him about, what was the specific scenario? But
healing of the hand?
No, hold on. I just talked about it yesterday with Tanya. Anyway, he basically was like, it was when he was calling Matthew, the tax collector, to be a disciple, and Matthew followed him, and then he threw a feast. And so it was a bunch of Matthew's colleagues and friends and stuff like that. And so it was people that the Pharisees and the religious and observant Jews and stuff would not be spending time with. And the Pharisees were like, hey, like, why are you eating with all these sinners and tax collectors? And Jesus said, the healed don't need the physician. The sick need the physician. That's why I'm here. That's like the whole point. That's what the church should be. And sometimes the church gets really caught up and there's nothing wrong with ministering to your own people. That's important. The connection in the community is super, super important. But then I think sometimes they get so caught up in that, and we forget that there's a lot of hurt still happening. And so anyway, there's a lot there to be said, and we're going to keep going. So another reason that people don't really reach out for help is sort of ingrained within this whole concept still kind of faith-based background, is this idea that, well, I have to respect my husband. Okay. And so we've talked about this with the whole hierarchy, complementarianism. My husband's the leader of the house. That's just the way it works when you get married. Doesn't work. There's a lot of reasons this doesn't work, but if it were ever to work, it would have to be where, he is actually behaving like Christ. The moment that he destroys the marriage vows and is struggling with something that is so overwhelming and controlling of his mind and his body and his behaviors, like an addiction, that is not somebody that has the capability to be in an emotional or psychological or spiritual leadership position. And so even if you subscribe wholeheartedly to that belief system, it's really null and void when this happens in your life. And honestly, a good leader is humble enough to say, I can't lead right now because I need help. And so again, even if you really hold on to that ideal, it just doesn't work in these situations. So the idea of, well, I have to respect my husband, loving someone and respecting someone doesn't mean that you get walked on. It doesn't mean that you allow yourself to get abused. And it doesn't mean that that person doesn't have to deal with the consequences of their behaviors.
Yeah, agreed. I think there's countless examples in just, you mentioned leadership, and just leadership examples where people have said, I'm hurting, I need to step away for a period of time and come back and then be in charge of an organization. So why would that not be any different in a marriage as well? If you subscribe to that. And so I really do believe that healing is the most important. The rank structure is the least important. And so, getting into that healing piece, you can always reevaluate that whole thing, once everybody's in perfect healing at that point, whatever that may mean for you and your belief system and all of those things.
Which I would encourage you, to reevaluate.
Yeah.
There's a book, let me see if I can pull it up really quickly, called I believe it was called The End of Patriarchy. In the church or something like that. Oh, yes, it's How God Sees Women is the title of it. And it's the end of patriarchy. And so if you are someone that subscribes to the belief system of complementarianism, where the male is automatically in charge of the female, then I would encourage you to read that book, because it's actually written by a pastor who promoted and preached and defended complementarianism for a really long time, then started doing some research and completely shifted his opinion when he was like, that's actually not what the Bible teaches at all. The Bible teaches equality from all the way back in Genesis. It's important to bring that up, because a lot of women, especially faith-based women, have this really ingrained, deep belief system that they will be wrong if they take any sort of leadership position in the household, even when I would argue that it's required in a healthy relationship dynamic when this happens. And so, just how did that, I know we've talked about this in various different ways, but there were several times where, I guess if I would word it that way, that I took leadership. It's we might even use different words, right? Like, I was helping you.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you believe that, if you really subscribe to that belief system, then the roles would have completely flipped if you were looking at our relationship at that time, where I was like, okay, this is what needs to be done. I was really saying, this is the plan. This is what's going to happen. You need to go here. This is where you get help. I was driving, right? And so, from the perspective of a male who is a Christian, who had that role reversal, I guess if you wanted to say it that way, or having step into that position, what do you think are the benefits of that happening?
Well, it was I never thought that we were in that kind of relation. I always looked at us as equal too. Yeah. The one thing that was a little bit different was because I was the biological father of Keegan. I was kind of like, well, that's probably a little bit more my responsibility than yours. And that was always, you know what I mean? Like he was, but so I never really felt like it was a hierarchical thing. To me, it was, there was a hierarchy that was established post-discovery,
temporarily.
But yeah, I thought that was temporary. And we've talked about it on this podcast. Over time, we we rolled back some of those boundaries. We established that equality, that equal footing with each other and that sort of thing. And there's gifts I have and there's gifts you have in a relationship. We kind of went back to that.
Did you at any time feel like when I was like helping you get things done and pushing you, did you ever feel like that was, or setting boundaries or any of that? Did you ever feel like any of that was disrespectful?
I mean, in my own woundedness, and I think once again we've talked about this on the podcast. I think there was a moment in my where I was like, I think she just wants to control me. But that's healing. That was healing I was going through. That wasn't me in my right mind. You know what I mean? Like in a moment where you might be frustrated about something, because recovery's hard. Like.
Yeah.
Like we talked about this on the last one. I was at one point, I'm a 50-year-old man, and then I'm having all these boundaries. And so it was hard to kind of get in there. 10,000 foot level, I understood why they were there.
Yeah.
Sometimes in the moment and you're tired, you're like, why are we doing this? You know what I mean? So
yeah, but do you think that's disrespectful of who you like? Yeah.
No.
As a partner.
And certainly being able to look back and go, hey, this was all for a purpose, and it actually served a purpose. And then where a boundary no longer worked, then the conversation was had, and disrespect would have been like, well, I don't care what you say.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That would have been.
And the thing that when it comes to respect is, in a healthy relationship, it has to go both ways.
That's right.
And I think a lot of times when we're talking about this, it's like when we're talking about the idea of why betrayed partners don't reach out for help, and one of the things that comes up is, well, I have to be respectful of my husband. It's like, okay, well, where's the respect for you?
Right.
This has destroyed your life. Like, it goes both ways. So just keep that in mind when you're making these decisions. One that's a really significant one that I hear is that they don't want to ruin his public perception. So that's a really interesting one. And I totally get that. I think we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about like deciding who to talk to, how much to share, like that sort of thing. But that is definitely one that comes up. And it is one that we had to think through based on how we decided to handle everything. Ultimately, I think the way we chose to do it was basically from the place of what's the goal for us. And we know who we are and how we view each other. People that aren't willing to get to know us well enough to see who we are, that's their choice. And we just need to be aligned and comfortable with who we are and what we do and where we are in healing. I think that's kind of ultimately where we came with that fear. Because it is scary. I mean, I'm not going to diminish that. Like it's,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember thinking, I don't know how this, it was just in my own mind as I was trying to figure things out, like, how does this play into my relationship at work? Does work have a say? There were some things like that I couldn't figure out within the first couple of months. So that was a good example to say, let's not be spreading it around at work. Let's figure it out. Let's get to.
Well, and I also think it's a little bit different when you're thinking about, are you sharing your story or asking for help or communicating what's happening in your life like the day that it happened? Or are you sharing it a little bit into recovery, right? From the addict perspective, it's a very, very different. And so you waited until you got into sobriety, and then you started telling important people that you work with and that are your super, whatever you would say, your bosses or whatever.
Boss and, peer relationship.
Yeah, peer and boss, and that always went well for you. And I think that's the thing is, again, kind of going back to the beginning, like we always create these stories. I think really in the end, like it has to boil down to, if I am being honest and if I'm living a life of integrity, and if I like who I am and somebody doesn't accept that, is that the type of relationship that I want to have in my life? I think that's an important consideration. But yeah, public perception is a really interesting thing. So one of the things I want to say kind of around that idea is, often the fear that we have of what others think is a direct reflection of how we actually view ourselves, or insecurities that we have about ourselves or the decisions we are making. So healing is this process of really coming into alignment with who you are, what you believe, and how you're behaving. And all of those are sort of in alignment with each other. And so when you're not living in alignment, that is what causes distress and emotional conflict. So if you're somebody that like your thoughts, your beliefs, your actions, like they're all sort of aligned, and you feel really comfortable with who you are at this point in time and the decisions that you're making, it's going to be a little bit easier to say, okay, you know what? If somebody doesn't agree with that, that's more about them than it is about me. But if we feel internalized conflict, and this is where I see a lot of times with betrayed partners, there's a lot of internalized conflict as they're trying to make these decisions. They're like, well, if I say it means this about me. If I leave, it means this about me. If I communicate this and it's embarrassing, or I'm carrying a lot of shame around this, right? And so there's certainly a process. We talk a lot about the healing process and that sort of thing, but just some of the things to think about there.
So like, I remember thinking that like, as we were talking about, I was like, man, everybody's going to think I'm a weirdo. And I think it was like, well, that's because I thought I was a weirdo. You know what I mean? And so it was like, as that resolved itself a little bit more, and I kind of recognized that, hey, I'm not the only one in the history of the planet that's dealing with this issue. And it is as I've learned about it and like how I got there and all of that stuff, I was like, okay, I can speak it with strength. And once again, it wasn't 12 hours in, it was 3 months, 4 months, 5 months in, you start to understand where you're going.
Mm-hmm. So another reason people don't want to share their story or reach out or talk to their friends or family is to protect their kids. It's like nobody knows, or they don't want, or they maybe do talk to some people, but they never tell their kids. We've talked about that before. I would definitely encourage you to go listen to, there's several episodes on the Pure Desire podcast about talking about sexuality with your kids, sharing your story with your kids. There's an episode that we have about talking about recovery with your kids. We do not think that you should our personal opinion is that it's healthier for you to find age appropriate ways to let your kids in on what's happening in your life than to try to never let them in, because there's going to be something that slips through the cracks, whether it's the anxiety, whether it's the tension, whether it's the fear or the shame or whatever that they're going to absorb on it. But at minimum, it's not having the ability to talk to them about pornography, about healthy sexuality, about healthy ways of relating to other human beings, about humanizing the opposite sex, all of these things that often contribute to betrayal and pornography addiction and sex addiction, that you now have an opportunity to really come from a healthy place to share with your kids so that they are more equipped to go into the world as adults, not having those patterns repeated. And so we really, really encourage people to read some books, listen to some podcasts about it, practice having these conversations with your kids. Again, in an age appropriate manner. Okay. We're not telling you to just, share inappropriate graphic details. We're not telling you to tell the same level of information that you tell your spouse in a disclosure to your children, but give them, information around the idea that they are aware of what's happening. And again, this is from a place of recovery, right? Like, so maybe not day one, but getting into recovery and being willing to share your story. And that's kind of what we're talking about.
When there was a consideration when you went public on social media, if you recall, so we decided to wait on that until Keegan had graduated high school, because he had been on the receiving end of some bullying reference to your social media. Mm-hmm. So there had been some classmates of his which
was nothing inappropriate that I had posted. Right. It was just like photos of the family.
Yeah. And they had done some inappropriate things. So what we decided was we were going to wait till after he was graduated. So those kids, which weren't his main circle of friends, but so those kids would not have access to try to bully him. So that was a consideration.
And again, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but this isn't even under the umbrella of like going public, like social media, like we have. Like, we're just talking about like, are you willing to like tell a friend? Like, so there's definitely different considerations when you choose to do something like we have. And that was a huge one for sure. Kids are always they always have a place in the decision making for sure. In every decision you make. Okay. And then the last one that I thought of when I was thinking about reasons people don't want to share their story is this idea that, okay, like if we reconcile, so I had mentioned earlier, it's like, or did I mention this one? Afraid if you reconcile, friends or family won't accept them, they'll always be stigmatized. Okay, so this one kind of goes with that. So the idea that if you reconcile with your spouse, and you have really let some of your friends or family in on the pain that you've been going through, there's a fear that they will always stigmatize or hate the spouse. And so along with that, there's this idea of like, well, if I do want recover, I just want to live a normal life after it. Like, I don't want people to really know what I went through, right? So to that, it's a totally normal thought, right? But I think it's important to have people that are team you. If they are really truly team you, then and let's think about like the process of reconciliation, right? Are you someone that's going to reconcile if your spouse is still abusing you or still acting out or still cheating on you regularly? If your answer is no, then the healthy version of reconciliation looks like they're doing the work. They're getting into recovery. They're doing all of these things that are changing their life and their behavior, and they're no longer hurting you. So someone that is truly team you and sees your spouse doing that work and and you're communicating through that process as well, hopefully they are also someone with love and compassion and empathy that can come in and go, oh, I do see like why you would make this decision, right? You can have those conversations through the process. If they're not, that's kind of a question again of like, what kind of people do we want to stay connected to in life? Do we just want to stay connected to people that we can only talk about the shallow things with, and that we can only say, hey, how's the weather today? Like, how was the soccer game on Saturday? Or, do we want to find the people that are willing to go, this is really hard. How do you feel about this? What's going on in your life right now? Okay, how did that conversation go last week with your husband that we talked about? Those sorts of things. Oh, wow, he's doing really good. Are you nervous about relapse, right? These are normal questions that people are going to have. And if you think about before we got into this world, if someone had come to us, we would have had so many questions too, right? Of like, well, what does that mean? And so just being willing to like kind of walk someone through. So it's a real fear that the spouse that has done the betraying can be stigmatized, but at the same time, really, for the most part, that has not been. There will always be the outliers. There will always be those people, right? But for the most part, what they really want is health for you, health and happiness for you. And so if you do reconcile and you get to this really healthy place and it's this life transforming experience, then a lot of the people that go through this with you will understand that and support you as well. And if they don't, and if you know ahead of time that they're not that kind of person, then don't share it with them for sure. But also just thinking through like, what kind of friendship is this? Because there are different levels of friendship, and that's okay. Yeah. But knowing who those people are, right?
I remember talking to Charles early on, and we had this conversation about who we should share with, who should we not. And he very clearly said to me, he's like, anybody that you share with should be somebody that you consider that can help you in your recovery. And of course, this is coming from my side, the addicted side, right? So he was talking about somebody that wouldn't shame me. He was talking about somebody that would listen, that would be able to kind of support me through this and that sort of thing. So I think that's great advice on both sides. How are they going to help you through your recovery? Because your recovery may ultimately include reconciliation. And so, are they going to be able to kind of steer with you all the way through that? Are they going to, hey, these are your decisions, I'm supporting you.
Or, kind of like we were talking about the church earlier, some people might go like the opposite direction and be like, well, you have to stay married no matter what. Like the people that you want to be talking to are people that are team you, like truly, truly team you. What they want is your mental, physical, psychological, and emotional health.
Right.
Like that's what you want in your relationship circle through this process. And little side note, that's why support groups and therapy exist, because there are situations where it truly is the case that family and friends are not going to do that for you. And so that's why these other things are there to provide that for you. And but I would say like a majority of the time, there are friends and family that would be very, very supportive when they are allowed to be let in and ask questions and stuff like that. So a majority of the time, I think someone has at least 1 to 2 safe people in their circle that they can open up to. And so we've just kind of gone through some of the fears. So to recap that, church pressure, The idea of respecting my husband at all costs, don't want to ruin his public perception, afraid if I reconcile, friends or family won't accept him later, protecting the kids, or wanting to move on with normal life after recovery. So those are just a few reasons that people are like, I will never tell anyone in my life what's happening. Okay, so let's talk about what this does and why not sharing with anybody can actually be a real problem and can really hinder your own recovery. I would say one reason is, I think we briefly mentioned this already, it's protecting the addict from the actual normal consequences of his behavior while also transferring the responsibility completely on you, the betrayed partner, to now deal with the pain alone. So it's not your job. This is a really bad thing in your life that has happened to you. Betrayal feels very different than other addictions and other addictive patterns because sex is involved. And so that feels very personal. And so there's a lot of embarrassment and shame that the betrayed partner can take on that's not ours. And so a lot of times if someone chooses not to talk about it to someone, and again, we're not talking about the way we have publicly, we're talking about like reaching out to a friend, reaching out to a family member that is safe, or a therapist for support group, right? Those types of things. When you feel like I have to keep all of this pain inside, it will be incredibly physically and emotionally detrimental for you. We're not meant to do this alone. We're not really capable of making sense of it alone. And I can't tell you how many times in coaching sessions where I'm working with a betrayed partner, just clarifying and telling them that the mixed up, complex emotions that they're feeling is normal, and helping to explain to them what phase of the recovery process they're in and what they're experiencing and feeling is normal, and maybe what they might expect moving forward, helps them feel seen and validated immediately. Just hearing that they're not alone, that it's normal, that every betrayed partner feels that way. So whether it's a support group or a friend, it's super, super, super important, because you don't have to do this alone. This is not about you. This is something bad that has happened to you. It's like you got into a massive car accident that destroyed your house, and you're not willing to tell anybody about it because you're afraid of implicating the person that destroyed your house.
Ironically, what's interesting is maybe some of that behavior on the addict side, where maybe they went through something traumatic and didn't share it and then led to the behavior. Think about that again. So then all of a sudden you're the betrayed and you're not going to say anything. You could almost perpetuate the pattern versus saying, hey, let's get you some support. Let's allow you to talk this through, because it is a major trauma on you.
Oh my gosh, that's such a valid point, is the repetition of the same patterns that got you here in the first place. We don't want to do that. We want to break those patterns. So yeah, I think the way to summarize that is trauma unspoken leads to more trauma.
That's right.
That would be the simplest way to say that, I think. And so what that leads to is carrying shame that's not yours. And over time, what we see is more psychological, emotional, and physical distress when that's not resolved. And the first step to recovery on both sides, is finding safe people to talk to, because what that does is it takes this scary, traumatic, overwhelming, embarrassing thing in your head that you're creating a million stories around, and brings it out into light, and someone else goes, oh yeah, me too. Or, oh yeah, here, why don't you connect to this therapist? Or, oh, here's a support group. Or, oh yeah, my best friend went through that, or, oh yeah, I struggled with that 5 years ago. You know what I mean? Like,
when I told my boss, I was so nervous to tell him, he was like, oh yeah, I've had a lot of friends who've gone through this. And I was like, oh, okay. And it made it feel better right away, because it was immediately.
Okay, so we talked about a lot of the reasons that we don't want to tell people or reach out to somebody. Let's talk about reasons we feel like you should. Number one, it allows you to live in truth and authenticity. We did, I think, episode 1 of 2024 was the importance of honesty, and the importance of the first 2 episodes were like the importance of honesty and living a life of authenticity. This has tremendous benefit in your day-to-day life. Just thinking about like the alignment with your nervous system and how you show up and how confident you feel in who you are and how you converse with people. And again, what I mentioned earlier, caring or not caring what other people think. The more you like yourself, the more you feel like you are living in self-integrity, the better you're going to feel. And for both people, you're going to have, it's going to feel safer when you, again, so we just talked about like you share your story with somebody, you say, hey, this is what's happening. I'm in a lot of pain. Somebody normalizes it for you, sees you, you feel seen, you feel validated, right? Immediately, that is safer for your nervous system because you don't feel like you're living a lie. And you don't have to worry about who knows and who doesn't, right? If you've ever been in that place where it's like, well, some people know what's going on, but then these people don't. And I have to make sure that like, I'm not talking about this or, whatever, or I'm feeling really depressed today, but I can't tell people why. So what's the story I'm going to tell? Or, I'm going to be triggered by certain conversations with certain, right? And it's just, wow, that's hard and exhausting and difficult to manage that, right? Or you're telling like absolutely no one, and you're absolutely living in this state of distress and depression and anxiety and fear and hypervigilance and worrying about your partner and you're trying to handle work, you're trying to handle your kids, you're trying to handle your partner. And then all of a sudden, like you can't really socialize because that's just another stressor because you can't talk about anything that's actually going on in your life. So when you do have people that you can talk to, and you feel more aligned, it's like, yes, this really horrible thing is happening to me. Yes, it's really hard. I'm struggling with anxiety. I'm struggling with depression. I'm going to see a therapist. I'm getting support, right? And this doesn't mean you're sharing every detail with your neighbor necessarily, but at least having the ability to talk to people is going to be super important for your nervous system.
You heal in community. And so you always heal in community. You rarely ever heal by yourself from anything. And so we always heal in community. So that's the important part of this is even your adult children or your mature children who can help you through this as you help them, obviously age appropriate, right? But you heal in community. Families that connect and are deeply open with each other and vulnerable with each other on a lot of things tend to heal better. They tend to be supported, and this is no different. So that's healing comes from community.
Reaching out to someone, friend, family member, support group allows you to gain support and validation. We've kind of talked about that. It allows you to meet others who have the same or similar experiences. So when this happens, I can't emphasize enough how much on both sides, I think you feel like alone. You feel like I'm the only person going through this. This is the worst thing that's ever happened. Nobody understands. It's overwhelming. You feel very, very isolated and you feel incredibly alone. So when you're able to meet somebody that goes, oh yeah, that happened to me, and this is how I've healed, and everything you're feeling is normal, and this is what we did, or just let me listen, let me encourage you, let me support you, you're normal, I love you, I'm here, what do you need? Any of those things makes you feel like a human being who is not going through this by yourself, because you're not. The reality is you're not. You might feel like you are, but you're not. If you feel like you're alone right now, you just need to connect to the right people. And again, sometimes that's not friends or family, that's support groups. But most of the time we have at least one or two people that are just so team you that they'll be like, what do you need from me? Do you need me to, do you need to listen today? Do you need to vent today? Do you want me to, set something on fire for you? Like, how can I support you? You know what I mean? Like,
bringing coffee and coming over.
Yeah, I'm bringing the food, bringing the ice cream. So yeah, and we did a couple episodes several months ago. Like if you are kind of on the fence, but like someone has expressed interest in supporting you, we have episodes of like, hey, share this episode so they understand what you're going through, and so they can ask you questions that are helpful, not hurtful. So we have those episodes. Just scroll back through the episodes and check those out. We have one for supporting the addict and one for supporting the betrayed partner. So those are there to help you have these conversations and feel a little bit safer. And then the last reason that we really think it's beneficial to share your story with somebody is, when you come from a healed place over time, you have the ability to help others and spread awareness. And again, after you work through the healing, that's very, very important. So I clarified at the beginning of the episode, what we're talking about here is reaching out on a personal basis. And we're not talking about like blasting your husband on Facebook and going, yesterday I found out that my husband is a porn addict, right? Like that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about sharing your story by reaching out for help. sharing it with your best friend, sharing it with your cousin who has always been there to support you, reaching out to your mom who was willing to ask questions or whatever, right? And then when you are able to come from a place of healing, when you feel like, whatever decision you make, whether it's to stay together and reconcile or to separate or whatever, but when you've been able to recover enough and to heal, one of the best reasons to share your story with anybody in any situation is because when you do that and people start to know who you are and what you've been through in life, you are able to help other people and you can connect them to the resources that have helped you. And I've seen that so often in life. Like I went through cancer and I still periodically, and I talked about it very publicly. I talked about my journey. I wrote a book about it. I shared every step of the way as we kind of went through that process. And I still, to this day, have people occasionally reach out and ask questions about, what would you do for, so-and-so just got diagnosed? Like, what would you do for here? What would you do with this? And so I think the more you can connect with people on a level of like, this is who I am, this is what I've been through, this is what I've done that has helped me. It doesn't have to be grand scale at all. It can just be friend to friend, family member to family member. There's a network, right? There's a web of friendship and connection and community that eventually allows you to help somebody else. And sometimes all that means is being somebody that's willing to get on the phone with somebody else going through it and go, I understand, I've been through this. How can I support you? Let me listen to your pain and encourage you that like, I'm in a different place today.
Coming from the addict side, don't let the addict say to you, I don't want you to tell your parents. I don't want you to tell your brother. I don't want you to, that's not their call. And so, if that is coming at you, that's coming from their own fears and their own woundedness. Because I can tell you this, with 100% certainty, if the addict gets into recovery and does the work, all those familial relationships and things will end up being okay. So like you just
or not, they agree with the process.
Right. Exactly. So don't allow if you feel that you need to go and talk to person X about this because you need it for your healing, don't let the addict talk you out of it. Just go seek out that help.
Yeah, I would highly encourage that. Okay, so some final considerations when you're thinking about this. Number one, we've touched on this several times throughout this episode, who to tell. So the idea, and we're going to do, I think, a separate episode on finding safe people where we'll just talk about this. So I'm just going to touch on it very briefly. But who to tell, we've kind of touched on a little bit through this episode. It's people that are team you. Okay, that's who you're going to want to tell. People that you feel like are going to be safe people, that are not going to be judgmental and that are going to go with you on the journey, whatever direction that takes you. Those are the people you're going to want to tell. And if you're not sure who that is, start by getting connected to a coach, a practitioner, a therapist, a support group, those types of things. Okay. How much to tell is the second consideration. So again, different friends, different family members, different scenarios is going to be different, not versions of the story, different levels of the story, right? So what you tell your kids is going to be age appropriate. What you tell your best friend might be everything that you learn every step of the way. What you tell your therapist might be all the gory details, all the fears, all the insecurities, like all of these things that you're struggling with, all the triggers, like all the emotional stuff. What you tell in your support group is like all the questions, like, is this normal? Like, what was your experience, right? Like, all of those things, it's not, lack of authenticity to ask different questions or have different conversations in an appropriate way but that's the consideration. It's like, who do I want to talk to? And when I'm talking to that person, how much do I want to tell them? And that's going to be based on the environment and the safety that is provided in that relationship. And then the third consideration is when to share publicly, if ever. Okay. So we've reiterated that several times. You do not have to be us. When we are saying, please share your story, we're not saying, please share, start a podcast. If you want to, that's great. We need more of them out there talking about this topic. But that's not what we're saying. We're saying, I want you to be able to heal as the addict you need support. I want you to be able to heal as a betrayed partner. You need support. You cannot just internalize these emotions and try to mentally process them on your own. That is like saying a bomb has exploded in my chest and I'm not going to go to surgery for it. I'm not going to go to people that have experience in pulling out the shrapnel. I'm going to try to do it myself. And guess what happens? You bleed out. Like, you might survive, but there's scarring, there's wounding that can be so different if you allow people to see who you are and to love you through the process and to support you through the process. You do not have to do this alone. So when you're thinking about sharing it publicly, if that is something, because a lot of women do very quickly come to this place where they're like, this isn't talked about enough. This is so painful. Why didn't I know that this was happening to so many people earlier? The church doesn't talk about this. And like 4, 5, 6 months into the process, they're like, I want to do something with this if I make it through. And I do hear that from several people. And so if that is you and you're like, I want to write a book, I want to start a podcast, my encouragement to that would be wait, not don't do it. Wait. Ride this out, make sure that you feel really comfortable getting into a place of true recovery where you're at least solid enough that you're like, I know exactly where I am. We waited 1.5 years to even talk about it publicly online. And then I think 2 years at least until we started the podcast, maybe longer. It might be longer. Yeah. And that even, like, looking back, I'm like, oh gosh, that was like so early. 1.5 years felt like at the time it was like the right time. But looking back, I'm like, wow, that was still so early in our journey. Right. There's still so much to do. Mm-hmm. But my encouragement would certainly be definitely think about it, plan on it, sit on it. Because when you share publicly in any context, whether it's writing a book, whether it is going on social media, whether it is on a podcast or speaking in front of churches or giving a testimonial or sharing privately in smaller groups, whatever it is, anytime you're going to share your story in front of a group of people, you want to make sure that that's coming from a place of healing. I mean, we've talked about this. We see CSATs that, might still be addicts. We see people that are supposedly coaching or offering therapy for betrayed partners that hate men. Like, these are not coming from places of true healing. And so if you are going to be a voice out there, you want to do a gut check and make sure that you're coming from a place of alignment. You're coming from a place of recovery. You're coming from a place where you can guide people. Again, what is healthy for them? So you're not pushing an agenda, right? Like, you don't want to get out there and be like, well, I reconciled my marriage, everyone should reconcile theirs. Or I got divorced, everyone should get divorced. Cheaters always cheat, right? You want to come from a healed perspective and a healed mentality where you go, every story is different. Let me help guide you to the resources where you can determine what's going to be the healthy choice for you. And if you have a transformation story, being willing to share that in these different venues, I would encourage you highly to do that because it is important. It is needed. So I mentioned a couple of places, if you are thinking about sharing publicly, that's the biggest consideration, is making sure it's coming from a place of healing and encouragement. And then, sharing tools and resources for sure. But there's a couple different, like we mentioned, like you could write a book, you could be on a podcast, you could just share it on social media. You could start a private Facebook group and just share privately. It could be like a little private support group. You could start a support group in your home. You could start a recovery group in a church. You could go out and speak to churches in front of the congregation if you are sharing your testimony or sharing your story of transformation. Or you could share, like, there are different like men's prayer groups or Bible studies or different gatherings that people have that are small within the church where you're sharing about a recovery group that you're starting or a recovery group that another church runs or whatever it is. Any of those are ways that when you are in a place of healing, you can begin to share your story. And Again, it doesn't even have to be that big. Even if you just share your story with a friend because you hear that she's going through something difficult with her husband, and then you go, hey, let me sit you down and share my story. I would love to give you some resources that might help you through this. Mm-hmm. And so we encourage you to do that. I want to kind of wrap this up by saying, we know it's not easy, but I do strongly believe that if you choose to not share your story with anybody, with not not getting support, not getting validation, not seeking that community, that will make it so much harder. And anytime you are able to be seen, be validated, be supported, be loved, even if it's from a group of strangers that get it because they've been through the same thing as you, like in a support group, it is going to transform this process for you. And so we would just encourage you to do that sooner rather than later. And we hope that this has been encouraging and maybe help you think through some things. I'm sure we didn't hit on every point here, but we just wanted to share. This has been on my mind for a little while because I definitely think it's something that people struggle with. They literally get told, don't tell anyone that this happened to you. And that breaks my heart every time. I think it is so cruel to tell that to people because healing happens in community and it's important that we talk to each other. Well,
and one of the things before we close out is what I noticed is, the first time you tell somebody, it's very scary. Mm-hmm. And then, but through that process, you're healing, right? So you're healing more. Then the second time's a little bit easier. Then the third time's a little bit easier. Then the fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh and 28th and 40th time, you're actually coming from a standpoint of really massive healing. And the story starts to take on a different new meaning. It's a story of strength, a story of victory, a story of freedom. And, where you actually find that you're helping people versus seeking the help. And so I think as you don't rob yourself of that experience, through this process.
I would say from the betrayed partner side, the exact same thing. When I started going to a support group, even though everyone in there had a version of the same story, the first so many times that I was like, my husband is a sex addict, that coming out of my mouth was just weird and embarrassing. And I didn't want all eyes on me as I shared my story. It felt really uncomfortable, even though it's not, again, it's what happened to me. It's not something that I did. It felt terrible to share. And so it's really hard. So we're certainly not undermining that. But the more I did it, and then the more I shared my story, and then I start going on podcasts and sharing my story and our story. And, even, the first maybe couple times you start doing that, you're like, wow, this is like really nerve wracking. Right. And then, but you do it and you do it and you do it and you do it and you do it more and you do it more and you do it more. And now it is this thing where I've had a friend of mine come up and be like, we just love you and Patrick so much because you guys are like, yep, this is who we are. And we're willing to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And it has encouraged them. And I think because of that, they feel safe coming to us because they're like, oh, they'll talk about it. Right. And so because they'll talk about it, I can share my stuff with them. Mm-hmm. And so it can absolutely transform your life and your relationships, I think, in a positive way. And the more it takes bravery and courage to speak out the first 100 times, maybe, but the more you do it, the less shame you're going to feel. And the less shame you feel, the more you're going to step into the light. And the more you step into the light, the more authentic and confident you're going to feel in life. And the more you can live life that way from an aligned place, the happier and the lighter and the freer, the freedom will come through that. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. We will see you next week.
Woohoo! If you're listening to this, it means you've made it through an entire episode. Part of recovery is spending time engaging in healing and self-growth activities. We are thankful that you chose our podcast to be one of those activities today. Make sure you reward yourself for that accomplishment. If you've enjoyed this episode or this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please take just a few moments to leave a rating and review, letting us know your experience with Recover You. We not only love hearing how these episodes are helpful, but ratings and reviews help others just like you who are searching for recovery information and support find the podcast too. We can't wait to hear from you. See you next week.